Oops. Yeah, that's all right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Christian Esquin, the president of the Coronado Roundtable. And I'd like to start our program on this beautiful Coronado morning. I think many of you have your cup of coffee in hand, so now that I have you seated, I'd like to have you stand up.
Yeah.
I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As you may know, our programs are recorded for Zoom. So we'd like to thank the Coronado Public Library for that service. And we have with us Selena, yeah, the lead. And Kelly, are you helping us also? Just assisting a little bit for this thing on the side. So thank you very much. So the Zoom will be provided live now, but also later on the library's YouTube channel. But for those of you viewing at home, could you please mute your computer or device and please turn off your camera. You may use your chat box for the question and answer period that we will have later. If you can't hear at the back of the room, please let us know. Our coffee this morning is provided by Amalo Brew, and we thank them. They're the coffee cart in front of the library, and we are asking, starting this month, for a $3 donation for that. We are very happy and pleased to have our speaker this morning, Kevin Ashley, which you've probably heard quite a bit about this month.
Sorry.
He's in the news and he has an exhibition at Coronado Historical. So please visit CHA if you get a chance. And we have our own board member, Kathy Parrish, who will provide the introduction. Kathy?
Hear me? This is only the second time I've ever used a microphone, so tell me if you can. Anyway, I'm very happy and proud to introduce my next door neighbor, Kevin and Ashley, and it's an interesting story. We are part of the bigger, it was a bigger, huge parcel of property. We got the garage and the monkey puzzle tree, giant monkey puzzle tree for our part, and the other couple that lives on the original piece got the tennis court. So, and we were waiting at the property. Went with a number of different people for a while, the home that they lived in, and but they bought that in 2013 and didn't move in till 2016, and were had spent that time doing a massive redo of the property that looked wonderful. That they became winners of the GEM Award, which is going the extra mile for historical places. And it's very lovely, lovely neighbors. When we met, my sister and I met Kevin first, just outside sometime, and he quickly told us that he was a native of California, that after college he and a friend put on a backpack and went all over the place. But during that travel, he fell in love with Kenya and stayed there for quite a time, teaching, and then and doing some volunteer work. And then he got involved in Kenya coffee. And it's very, very good, but we can't get it here. I got a bag from his beautiful wife, Caroline. Anyway, it's great. He has a lot to do. He's been working very hard on the Historical Society's current display, lots and lots of research. And I think you heard enough of me, and you will have Kevin come and tell you all about it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Can you hear me through the mic? Is it working? How's that working? It's okay. Can everybody hear me? Nope. Okay. Okay, sorry. I'm mic'd up here. Oh, sounds like you got me now. That's okay. How's that? Okay. Thanks everyone for inviting me to speak to you today on behalf of the Black history of Coronado. Kathy, you are an amazing neighbor. From the day we arrived, we felt welcome in Coronado. You represent everything, all the best aspects of Coronado, you represent them. And it's been just wonderful having you as a neighbor. So I'm going to say that. I'm here, my wife is also here. She's hiding over on the corner here, Caroline Ashley. She's come to sort of support. Yeah. So before I get into the exhibit, I've only been here for about 8 years. And I need to find out first from everybody here, how many people in this room have lived in Coronado for 10 years or more? Okay, I've already lost. 20 years or more. 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. My goodness, okay. You got it, John Drenner in the back. You win the prize. 85, fantastic. So I apologize to everyone in advance if any of I saw already there was a small date misprint on one of my slides. I am ready to be stand corrected on my research. The whole nature of research into a community is a team effort. It's a group effort. I just happen to be someone who went down the rabbit hole for a 3-year period to try to understand this history. So obviously in the question and answer period, you can share my email with anybody who wants. I want to be as transparent with this history as possible. So what I want to talk to you about today is to give you kind of a breadth of that history. The history is really divided into 3 very distinct chapters. The first chapter is the pioneers. These are the people who came to Coronado in 1886 and were here up until the middle of World War II into 1944. That's the first chapter. Most of our talk today will be on that chapter. The second chapter is actually the period of the Federal Housing Project, which sat for 25 years in Coronado between 1944 and 1969. Some people here remember that place well. People like John Drenner used to go and play with his buddies down there. And the third chapter is the chapter that we live in today. It started in 1969. Why? Because in 1969, the Coronado Bridge was opened and the federal housing projects were demolished and closed. So that third chapter is the chapter that my wife and I are a part of. And it's basically a chapter of either Navy families or people who have enough money to afford Coronado's housing, right? Which we were lucky enough to be in that category. So I'm not going to talk much at all today about that third category, the third chapter. We're going to talk about the first 2, mostly the first one. But then I will try to go into what is called hard history, uncomfortable history, that helps us understand what happened to that community. Why did they disappear in Coronado? And that I think all of us, I hope everyone here can just bear with me when I do go into that part of this story. So let's start and let's go back to before 1886. That's a tobacco field in Henderson, Kentucky. The majority of the African Americans who came to Coronado in 1886 were formerly enslaved in tobacco plantations in Henderson, Kentucky. That on the far left is a slave schedule from the 1860 census. Black people in 1860 were not counted with names. They were just on a list. They were numbered by their age, their sex, and whether they were Black or mulatto. Mulatto meaning they had white blood, usually from their master or someone who was an overseer. One of our Coronado residents is on that list under William Marshall. His name is Edmund Marshall. Of the early pioneers, at least 10 of our residents had been formerly enslaved in 1886 of the group of African Americans that lived here in the early period. On the far left, you'll see Amos Hudgens. You've heard about the Hudgens family recently, I believe, through the publishing of the book about the Hudgens. Amos is also, I'm honored to announce, will be amongst the those honored in the Avenue of Heroes this year. When he was 18 years old, he escaped slavery and crossed into Kansas and from Missouri and joined the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. He was wounded in the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. Those who know their Civil War history will know that Jenkins Ferry was a terribly ugly battle in Arkansas. His group took it upon themselves to charge an enemy artillery battery, losing countless men, but capturing the battery and turning the tide of the war of that battle to allow the other several thousand troops to cross a creek on a pontoon bridge. He later joined the Buffalo Soldiers and was amongst the first inaugural class of the 10th Cavalry in 1867 to 1872. I put just here Willis Easley in the middle. That's part of his muster out document from the 29th U.S. Colored Troops. Willis Easley lived in Coronado for about 15 years. Those who know their Civil War history probably know about the Battle of the Crater. Probably one of the most gruesome battles and horrific battles ever fought in our country's history on our soil. It was also a shameful part of the history because even Union soldiers began killing their Black comrades in order to save themselves as they were trapped in the crater and Confederates surrounded them. Willis Easley was not a slave. He was actually a free man from Indiana who joined when he was 18 years old. And at the Battle of the Crater, he was actually Sergeant Major, the highest possible rank for an African-American soldier at that time, which meant he was in the back of the column of 1,000 troops as they marched into the crater, making sure nobody tried to run. He later, in the Battle of the Crater, obviously it started by a huge explosion of more dynamite that's ever been blown in the history of the country, opening a hole in the line at Petersburg, sorry, and they tried to come in and capture it. He was later in Coronado, was threatened by some crazed local who threatened to dynamite his house. And, that guy clearly did not know who he was dealing with. Willis, just laughed that off. He says, you want to talk about dynamite, right? So he was also at Appomattox at the surrender. He was also in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, better known as Juneteenth. Edmund Marshall was at the siege of Petersburg. Edmund also was one of the first troops to march into Richmond when it fell. He was later in Texas and Mexico border as part of the Army of Occupation, trying to keep the French from doing any dirty deeds down there. So just a little bit about, and so in San Diego County, there was only 10 African-American Civil War veterans, and 3 of them lived in Coronado. After that, we had 4 Buffalo Soldiers live in Coronado amongst the pioneers. So Elisha Babcock, again, he was in Evansville. He came out to Coronado, for a holiday and obviously fell in love with the place. I mean, he was in San Diego, fell in love with the island, decided to buy it, brought some of his buddies from Evansville to help finance and build it. But he also brought a bunch of African Americans from Henderson, just over the Ohio River. So that was, this color was Kentucky and that color's Indiana. So this Henderson, Kentucky was 50% Black, former slaves, right? And so it was also extremely wealthy. So actually, the reason that Babcock went to Henderson was to try to raise money to finish the hotel. In the process, he brought some of the African Americans that you will learn more about with him to Coronado. Of course, in 1886, it was just a barren island on the left. You can see the modern plat of the town in 1887, which resembles almost identically to what we have today, except for the Spanish Bight being filled in, and a few other, the golf course and the fill-ish areas that came about later. So there were some trailblazers in here early, 1889. Here's from the San Diego directory. You'll see W.Z. Smith. He was a florist. He ran the Coronado Nursery. Resident was D Avenue between 1st and 2nd. He predated Kate Sessions as a nursery person in Coronado. He eventually moved to San Diego in 1895. Here's the entire Marshall family. Ed, it says laborer, Hotel Coronado. He was actually an engineer. He helped build the ice factory, the famous ice factory at the Dell. And there's his wife, who was a nurse, most likely to either Elisha Babcock's father or possibly to the Hind household, because the location of where they were living was right next to the Hind house. When we go into the Marshall family, you'll see this photo here. That's Florence Marshall, right in the second row and kind of to the left. That was Coronado's schools were integrated from the start, something we have to be proud of. We need to celebrate. There was plenty of states in the former Union states that did not integrate their schools. Coronado did that. It says a lot about our town's founders of Babcock and Hind. These were former Union men, and they believed in the idea of everybody's right to be free and everybody's right to participate. That's Louisa Marshall. That's incorrect. It should be 1897, 88, 98. She's already Ed Marshall's granddaughter, Richmond Marshall's daughter at Coronado School. Now, I told you about Amos Hudgens. The Hudgens family moved to Coronado in 1903. In 1906, Amos Hudgens' son graduated from Coronado School along with the same girl you just saw, Louise Marshall, and they were 2 of 16. So put that in perspective. 12.5% of the graduating class of Coronado School in 1906 were African American. Their parents owned property, they ran businesses, and they attended the schools. Today, we have 1% African American population of Coronado High School. The vast majority do not live here, or own property here, or run businesses here. They're usually Navy enlisted and their families, or they're inter-district transfers who come over for COSA and other programs. Richmond Marshall is one of the most impressive African Americans to ever live in Coronado. That's the father of Louisa Marshall, who graduated in 1906. He died 2 months after her graduation. He was the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Freemasons of the entire state of California. He and 3 other Coronadans, the Marshalls, 3 Marshalls and Gus Thompson, formed the Prince Hall Masons in San Diego in 1903. He was quickly catapulted to be the Grand Master of the state. He toured the state constantly, trying to organize a group of middle-class Black men to actually organize and uplift the community. He died of tuberculosis in Coronado. He also operated a successful laundry business, one of the best ones on C Avenue, a big laundry business that his wife and his daughter later continued to run after his death. So here we get into the Thompson family. That's Gus Thompson aboard a stagecoach in 1889. Gus Thompson, these photos that you see took years of research. These were not existing anywhere. I found them in UCLA's photo collection. I found them in the Prince Hall Masons archives. We didn't have these anywhere in Coronado. We didn't know about this. This is all new. So here's Gus Thompson on the stagecoach. We recognize that maybe the boathouse in the background. I'm not sure what that is, but it's obviously Coronado. He came in 1886. He worked for Babcock for close to 30 years. And he was famous for taking the first customers to the Hotel Del in January 1888. We're going to have we're going to end this program talking about the Thompson family in a very interesting story I'll share with you. But that's him in 1889. There you see Gus himself. He doesn't look black, right? That's a lot of people have a hard time understanding racial history of America. We had people called mulatto. We had people called quadroon. We had people called octoroon. It was the one drop rule. If you had one drop of visible black blood, you were a second-class citizen in America. He was born into slavery, probably a quadroon, quarter black. But that's his boarding stable right there in Coronado, right behind the existing Wells Fargo Bank. To the right is the Thompson house. You can just barely see the top of it popping up there. This was an ad from 1915 from the expo in San Diego that was in the San Diego newspaper of his auto service. He managed to make the transition from horses to cars and had a busy transport business as well. He's without question the most successful, most important person, and his wife, people in our history of African Americans in Coronado is the Thompson family. He was a delegate to the Republican convention in the 1890s with Babcock, if you can imagine. So that's his wife, Emma, to the right. In 1902 in Tent City, running a coffee shop. This photo was lost. We found this in UCLA's photo archives. That's Edith Thompson standing next to her. This is a picture of the Prince Hall Masons in 1907, 1908. You can see a very light-skinned guy right in the front to the right there. That's actually Gus Thompson. This whole group, the Prince Hall Freemasons, Fidelity Lodge still operates today across the bridge in Logan Heights. It's an institution to the Black community that has been a pillar for them. And their current Grand Master is none other than City of Coronado employee Jason Sevier, who spent much of the last month clearing our drains during the storm. Again, that's Gus Thompson with his daughter Edith later, when she's in 1910 roughly. That's actually Coronado, right? Could be Oklahoma or wherever, but that's actually Coronado. Okay, so this is a very fascinating picture. One story people don't realize is the significance of Coronado's football team between 1916 and 1920. We didn't have a high school until 1916. And from 1917 to 1920, that team dominated San Diego football. These boys, this group of boys right here, did nothing but play football all day to the point that people wrote to the newspapers complaining about them. And to the far left, on the bottom row, is Edward Thompson, the youngest of the Thompson children. Edward Thompson later became a star collegiate football player we'll talk about later. Remarkably, to understand racial history in America, look at the person standing behind him. That's his first cousin, who came to Coronado in 1900 from Henderson, Kentucky, whose parents were formerly enslaved. That's Leo Ellis, the first African-American graduate of Coronado High School, standing behind him. Edward below graduated the following year. Their eldest brother, Walter, had a dream of being a park ranger. So he was up in Tahoe area when he got the call to sign up. And that's an article from the Sacramento newspapers about the first colored man to leave for the Army. I put this picture here. Most everyone here would know that's the Musang Oregon Cemetery, the largest cemetery in Europe of American troops. So Walter was part of the 815th Pioneer Infantry Regiment. Some of you know your World War history. They know the pioneers were not quite engineers, but somewhere in between just basic soldiers and engineers. They built stuff, or they dug trenches, they did things. Well, he was amongst the last to arrive. When they landed, the war was over. So the 815th spent their 6 months doing the sacred duty of digging all the bodies from the battlefields of Musargan and interring them in this cemetery. I'm not sure he was able to shake some of the things he saw.
He never had children, by the way. So Edward Thompson, here he is in college. That's the front page of the sports page of the Los Angeles Times. He was the first collegiate football star, Black collegiate football star in Southern California history. His team almost fought USC to a draw at Little Whittier College, which, by the way, there was 4 other Coronado High School grads on that team. There he is, a picture of him as a halfback. He was elected captain of his team in 1923. That caused quite a stir, but that was his teammates voted for him for that honor. He ended up working for the Southern California Gas Company in Whittier the rest of his life, and his boss was one of his former Coronado High School teammates and Whittier College teammates. He was for much of the time, he was the only Black family living in Whittier because of the racial restrictions that happened soon after he settled there. There's Edith Thompson, all grown up, who was at Tent City. Edith Thompson was one of the first African-American college graduates in San Diego history. And she uniquely did not graduate from San Diego State. She was sent to a college in Kansas and graduated, which was a historically Black college at the time, and graduated from there. She came back and she married the Black tennis champion of the Western United States, Ballinger Kemp. The 2 of them were a power couple in Los Angeles. Their best friends were Paul Revere Williams, the famous architect from Los Angeles, amongst the greatest architects in our country's history. She worked for Betty Davis in Hollywood. She worked for Evelyn Keyes in Hollywood as a personal assistant. So a little bit about Edith. That's their mom, Emma Thompson, all grown up. Emma Thompson was a firecracker. This is her, in 1922, there was something called the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill, which ironically just passed about a year ago, symbolically. She was amongst the statewide Colored Women's Federation representatives lobbying for the passing of that bill. And that's an article about her doing that kind of work. She was later she was active well into the 1950s in various causes in San Diego with her church and with the YWCA. And we will talk more about Ms. Thompson at the very end. So here's the Hudgens family. You can see Amos and Cynthia in their wedding picture in 1874. That's Amos and Cynthia with little Algernon. I talked about who, I think I mentioned someone else about passing as white later, so I'll get to that. That's little Algernon, that's him with his mom there. They moved to Coronado in 1903, and a Hudgens or an ancestor lived in Coronado for the next 115 years until 2018 was the last ancestor that lived in Coronado. So that's Algie on the far left. You'll see him, he's wearing a uniform that doesn't seem like a kind of uniform that a African-American would have been allowed to wear in World War I. That's because he passed as white. And he was an expert at ham radio in Coronado from around 1907. He was practicing ham radio in his backyard. And so when he got the call to sign up with the California Naval Militia, he was given the job of chief radio electrician. And when he was in Europe during World War I, he met Scottish woman May Angus and convinced her to come to the US and marry her. You can see here a quote from her, from Algie and May's daughter, Cynthia, from her book. On her mother's first time out alone on the street in Coronado, she was accosted by strangers who wanted to know why a nice white girl like herself had married into that family of inwards. May was just 21 years old, alone in a strange country, undoubtedly homesick, married to a man she knew only through letters. She withdrew into herself, making only a handful of friends in her entire life in this city, in the country. That's their daughter, Cynthia, we'll talk about a little bit more. So May was so traumatized by what she found here, she did not want to raise her daughter, Cynthia. So Cynthia was then handed over to the grandparents to raise her. So she was raised by 2 formerly enslaved African-Americans, this girl who looked very much white in Coronado. And she tells that story of her life in Coronado in the book called The Other Side of the Fence, which is available on Amazon and also available in Coronado Historical Association. So Annie Hudgens, Amos Hudgens' wife, was struck by a car in 1934, right in front of Christ Episcopal Church. She was tossed 30 feet. She was at about 80 years old at the time. They took her body, rather than taking her to the Coronado hospital. Because she was African American, she was placed on the ferry, and they took her seriously damaged body to the San Diego County Hospital. Her passing as white son and daughter May threw a fit and managed to get her brought back to Coronado, where the Coronado Hospital agreed to put her in a custodial room at the back of the hospital. She lasted 2 more weeks. Her daughter, granddaughter, who was living with her at the time when the accident happened, Cynthia, would visit her daily and was with her when she died. As a result of this accident, which was caused by an underage teenage driver, son of a Navy officer, they did not want to admit guilt. So there was no one helping with hospital bills. Annie Hudgens went to Christ Episcopal Church for 30 years. No one from the church came to their aid. They lost their house because of those medical bills on B Avenue. So one thing I'm not going to talk too much about, but that you have to understand, there was hundreds of domestic African-American staff that lived in Coronado over this period, particularly up until about 1960. Those who have been around, they always saw them going on the ferry every day. This is Nanny Scott. She worked for Dr. William Needler. Dr. William Needler was the doctor of President Taft, who lived in Coronado for many years. I talked about the pioneers of Coronado. This is Charles Hind. He built Christ Episcopal Church and was an incredible man. His father was an abolitionist preacher in Illinois. He came out with Babcock and eventually became partners with John Spreckles and ran the Spreckles Company for about 25 years. When he died in 1915, he willed the equivalent of $75,000 in today's money to each of his 3 African-American employees. That's from the Black newspaper in Los Angeles, commenting about what an amazing guy he was for remembering his Black employees. After his death, the African-American community lost a protector, someone who actually included that community as part of the fabric of Coronado. One cannot tell the story of Coronado's African-American history without talking about Edward Anderson. He also came from Kentucky. That's him sitting to the left of Gus Thompson in the Freemason photo back around 1907. He is the most important African-American in San Diego County history in the first 50 years of the 20th century. He built multiple businesses across the county. He was responsible for taking on the trash collection contract in Coronado in 1917 and actually held that contract for 30 years while also running the hog farm that we all know about. The hog farm at the Cays, that was his hog farm. And guess what? Another thing my research developed, the hog farm, fronted the bay, but there was also beachfront there. African Americans did not have the ability to use our beaches in San Diego in the same way as other people well into the 40s and 50s. And in the 1940s, I found 5 different statements in the Los Angeles Black newspapers referring to Anderson Beach at the Silver Strand. And so he was quite, he made sure that the beach was a place where community and church groups can come and have large gatherings on the beach at Silver Strand. I think that would be a nice thing to be memorialized at some point. You can see Anderson Meat Market, a good place for his, he was famous for his pork sausages. That contract down below is just the contract he signed with the city for the hog farm. There was another interesting lady named Margaret Chance, and also James Walker. James Walker was the garbage man that worked for Edward Anderson for 30 years in Coronado and later worked for the city for about 5 years. They had a house at 279A Avenue. And in the 1920s, Miss Chance, who moved in after Mr. Walker's wife died, got busted for having a whiskey still. during Prohibition. And it was famous. She got called into court and she was fined $100. She broke down in tears because she only had 50. And Edward Anderson came out of nowhere and peeled off $50 and said, "Get out of here, let's go." And in 1938, she and James tried to start a boys' home, an orphanage on 279A to just take in some of the orphan African-American kids from San Diego, which created quite a stir, as you can see from the story there. Everyone from the chief of police to the city manager to the city attorney got involved to make sure that didn't happen. The very next year, there's this famous thing called the Green Book. Some people have seen the movie. It's basically African Americans, when they travel across America, they would actually use this book as places that were safe to go and stay or eat. Coronado's in the Green Book. In San Diego, there was only 6 entries in the entire San Diego area. The Douglas Hotel, which is famous for the Creole Palace, Simmons Hotel, and 3 tourist homes. And one of them, Margaret Chance, 279 A Street. You notice it said San Diego, not Coronado, probably because people would figure out how to find her and they'd stay in that house with them. So Mr. Walker, eventually, they both moved to Lake Elsinore about 1951. So when we talk about Black history, that we have to understand the Great Migration. The Great Migration roughly is 1916 to 1970. Now, Coronado, for its first 30 years, the population of African Americans was 2 to 3 times the California state average. Now think about that. California had a 1% Black population. And in Coronado, it was ranged between 2 to 3% for those first 30 years. And these weren't itinerant workers. These were people at homes, went to the schools. And so when the Great Migration started between 19 and 1970, that reality in Coronado mysteriously flipped. By the end of 1970, California was 7% African American, not 1%. But in Coronado, it was just a handful of people left. And in this presentation, I'm going to explain kind of what happened. So part of the Great Migration happened. There was a family that came in the Great Migration amongst the pioneers. That was the Ludlow family. That's James Ludlow there on the far left. He was a Buffalo soldier who served in the Philippines in the hospital corps. He was working as a chauffeur for the French ambassador during World War I, and mysteriously suddenly moved with his entire family of 6 kids to Coronado in 1919. I believe that it had to do with the fact that the French ambassador was a philanderer. The French ambassador's wife was the daughter of a founder of J.P. Morgan. And I think James must have been quite helpful in kind of fleshing out some of the stories there. And I think he got a sweetheart deal to just go to Coronado. And when he got here, there was a lady named Mary Lacey that took them in and then helped them buy a house, I think cash, and then later start a business, Satisfied Cleaners, which is where the Emerald Sea Gallery is today, which lasted just a few years. The Ludlows today, Claudia Ludlow is the general manager of the Glorieta Bay Hotel. So the Ludlow legacy lives on. Again, thinking about the patriotic service of the African-American community. Even though amongst all of the children of the Ludlows, only one graduated from Coronado High School. That was Paul in 1941. But when the call came for World War II, 5 Ludlow children served simultaneously in World War II. No other family in Coronado can make that claim. Another fascinating character in this town, in our town, is a guy named Emmett Rogers. Some people might remember Emmett and Fidelia, who are here in the 70s. She was on the left, she's Peruvian American, and the fellow in the yellow shirt, that's Emmett Rogers. Emmett is an extremely interesting guy. He grew up in the White House. That's his mother, Maggie Rogers, maid to 6 presidents in the White House. When he shipped off in World War I with the 365th Infantry, he was a 2nd lieutenant at age 20. How does that happen? probably you've got some friends in the White House. And when you put the address of your next of kin, you put Maggie Rogers, and then you put address the White House. That's on his document heading out to France. Not too many people got to say that. So Emmett Rogers lived in Coronado and his wife Fidelia for almost 50 years. When the Roosevelts came to Coronado to visit their son, I think at 641 A Avenue, they had Fidelia cook all the food in their little house at 958 I Avenue and bring it over to the Roosevelts in their son's house when they were visiting. I mean, he was president at the time, and she's cooking for the Roosevelts from their house. So they're also unique in that Emmett Rogers is the only African-American who succeeded in buying a house in Coronado between 1927 and 1989. We will get into how that happens, right? But I think he had some pretty good connections where, Eleanor Roosevelt could make a few calls probably, and I guess you'd not want to be on the other end of that phone call. Yeah. So I've talked just a bit about the pioneers. These are just a few people I selected. There's others that I didn't talk about, but that's some of the families I felt were prominent. Now we get in quickly. I'll talk to you about a little bit about the federal housing project. 1944, you had 744 units built there. They stood there for 25 years. In 1954, the city took them over from the federal government. And the city then started earning $100,000 a year profit from the rents they got from those apartments. You can tell they're pretty sparse. There wasn't a lot of landscaping. There was no street lights. That $100,000 could have been spent to uplift those places, but instead it helped Coronado build the golf course in its current site and maintain the golf course for almost 10 years from that money. So the rents of that place subsidized our golf course for about 10 years. Meanwhile, women were saying, my husband's in Vietnam and I'm walking home in the dark. So let's just try to understand the demographics a little bit. This is census data from 1950. In Coronado, the population in 1950 was 12,423. The Coronado Village Black population, that's our neighborhoods, right? The ones we know here, was 54 people in the Coronado Village out of 12,423. That's about 0.5%, right? But the majority of those were domestic staff just living in the houses of wealthier Coronadans. There was only one family remaining whose grandchild was attending Coronado High School. There was no other children living in the Coronado we know today from the original pioneer families in 1950. But at the same time, in that federal housing project of almost 3,000 people, 15% of the population were African Americans. So suddenly Coronado had this influx of diversity into the city, which enhanced our schools, which enhanced the community. And you can see here, 418 people African Americans were living in the projects. That was 100+ families. Here we're talking about one family. Here we're talking about 100 families. Their population of the projects was 15.8%. They brought the overall population of African Americans to Coronado to 3.34%. That is an important part of history we have to understand, because that was not the norm to have 3% Black population in any city in San Diego County outside of the city of San Diego. San Diego County census data of 1960. Now Coronado's population is raised up to 18,000. The combined 460 people from 1950 has reduced to only about 300, but that's still significant. 7 combined cities, Chula Vista, El Cajon, Escondido, Imperial Beach, Lemon Grove, La Mesa, Vista, combined almost 180,000 people, had just 138 African Americans living in those cities. And if you now imagine we went from 460 to 297, we knew it was 54 people in 1950, and that number is reduced. We know that the housing project population reduced. So if you took away the housing project, our numbers would be very similar with these other towns, which was basically telling the story of residential segregation of San Diego County at that time. So who were the kids that went to the Coronado High School, right? We see pictures, from these are pictures from 1955 to 1969. There's the varsity basketball squad that John Drenner used to be a part of that team. And then what happened, John?
When we were 15-1, I couldn't go to dances because we had strict curfews and stuff. We won the California State Small School CIF Championship, 27-1 record. Only lost to Hoover with 3,000 students. We had 400. They were not big school. We were a low school.
Yeah.
And I was on that team for half the year. And Charlie Love, Willie Dickey on that team, and Herman Wright was our star. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's great. So that gives you like that. They think about that. That's just 9 guys in that photo. Would have been 10 if John kind of kept it together, But we got 3 out of 9, 33% of that team. Look at that. Look at that attack with the football. 3 African Americans, Coronado's football team in 1955. Yeah.
People we went to basketball games a few years ago. Saw this guy Wayne McKinney.
Yeah.
Started Coronado High Star at USD now. Yeah. Our guard, Herman Wright, who lived in a housing project, was like him.
He was like the equivalent of Wayne McKinney back then. Some might remember Jim Robertson, graduate of 1967. Jim Love, class of 57. That's his sister Jean. Paul Morris, class of 68, most talented trumpet player. And Earl Barlow standing here in this photo, who was the first Black American to be a member of the San Diego Symphony at age 19, because he was mentored in Coronado by the Coronado band director and teachers. And from his little room in the Federal Housing Project, became one of the most celebrated musicians to come out of Coronado. So there was also a school next to the project called Glorieta School. Some might remember that. That stayed open until 1974. That's what the population of the federal housing projects looked like in Coronado. These people lived in Coronado, these folks. I don't mean to say these people. These are our people. And here we have Vivian Gales, the first African-American PTA president in Coronado Unified School District history, there at Glorieta School. So we come to an end of an era. There's the bridge, just about complete, 1969. There's the federal housing projects. That's Glorieta School right there. So that chapter comes to a close in 1969. Sorry, I'm just making a little bit of noise here. So now I want to get into some uncomfortable history. What happened? And to do this, we talk about race, we talk about racism, we talk about exclusion in Coronado going back to 1902 to 1968. When I grew up, now my dad's a hardcore Republican. He was a county supervisor in Riverside County. We knew to not talk about politics at the dinner table. We also realized don't talk about religion at the dinner table. But the one topic that people rarely even talk about, that you don't talk about at the dinner table, is race. It's so difficult. It's so hard because we have a history in this country, a history that I've already touched on. But I think this is a very impressive group that knows history, values history, and I want to take us through some of the things that happened in Coronado. So between 1902, 1903, and 1917, in Tent City, the same Tent City where Emma Thompson had our coffee shop for years, there was a game played where baseballs were thrown at African Americans. You can see in the photo there. There's no easy way to slice that. There's no way to say that's just good old fun. So there's a quote from the Tent City program referring to the game. There's another one referring to Peepoo, the African Dodger. That's one of the baseballs that would get thrown. And this one here is from the Spreckles family picnic of 1917. Knock the N-word down, baby down, and get a good cigar. That happened here. Coronado had a history of battle royale boxing spectacles. I first uncovered from 1917, and the last one I have is from 1940. Battle royales were part of smoker events where you'd have these boxing matches, and then for fun, you would bring African Americans out, blindfold them, and it would be the last man standing, and they'd fight against each other for a few coins. So they'd hold that cup in their hand and bang it to let everybody know where they are. And then they'd fight with the odd hand. You can see that's all Navy personnel around them there. And these are clearly stewards from the Navy being dressed up for that event. These happened in Coronado as late as 1940. The Harbor Day program, full of water thrills. It says here, at 3, a comical boxing match by Negroes on a raft. In 1936, in the ballroom, the Hotel Del, Church of Christ, their Episcopal Church, their vestry sponsored a gigantic minstrel blackface show. Those who know about that history, people tend to exaggerate African Americans' stereotypical characteristics. It's white people in blackface. No one would dare think of doing something like that today because we're more civilized. But in the 1930s, it was good fun. And that event was advertised in the paper. The co-producer was a Navy commander. The director of the musical production was the Coronado High School's band leader. And teachers, parents were amongst the side-splitting actors. And kids were in attendance. Over 1,000 people were in attendance. Harry Nash, the new pastor at Christ Church, was one of the organizers of this. I put this ad from the newspaper. This came from the same Coronado newspaper of 1936, just an odd story. Who's playing possum? It wasn't a N-word, but a strange-looking animal that spits and snarls that holed up in the woodpile of Mrs. Walter Poor at 1417 10th Street this morning. That was just kind of perfectly acceptable to put in the newspaper. So the Christ Church men's group continued with their minstrel shows. They went on through 1940. At the 50th anniversary of the Coronado Del, they had one again in the ballroom. And this sort of taught kids that that was okay. Because in the 1950s, that's what our Coronado high schools looked like in some of our yearbooks and various photographs. And that's when we had all these kids from the federal housing projects often in the audience. That particular one was from 1950. In 1946, a Coronado resident, young man named Alton Collier, is 25 years old. Him and his wife were living in Coronado. She was working as a nurse. He was working at a local hotel. He decided to go on the ferry to go visit friends in San Diego in 1946. And as soon as he got on board, he was accosted by multiple Navy men. It starts by calling him the N-word, and then eventually it got violent. He pulled out a knife to defend himself. And as a result, they took out a fishing, like a big spear stick that they use for reefs, and sort of threatened to stab him and then knocked him off the boat into the water. He drowned. San Diego and Coronado both called it not our problem. It's, territorial waters issue. The autopsy later said he was just an accidental drowning. No charges were made. The wife took his body back to Texas to bury him, and 1 year later, she sued the ferry company, and we do not know the result of what happened. Such an act is not far removed from some of the uglier history that Emma Thompson was fighting for. One thing as an African-American, you can't do is never fight back. If you do, you run the risk of being killed, and that's what happened to him. So now I want to get into the harder part of our housing history and housing discrimination. John is famous there, John Drenner. He's on the Coronado Historical Association VIP board. And one of his quotes says, Coronado in the 1940s to the 60s was a great place to be a kid. Trolleys ran, it was less crowded, and anybody with a steady job could afford a house. John and I have since spoken. So what we need to understand, what happened in Coronado happened everywhere in the country. So we're not singling out Coronado, but we need to understand what role Coronado played in our history of segregating our cities, in our country, up through the 1960s. So it started with the National Real Estate Board in 1924. They adopted a code of ethics. That code of ethics was forced on anyone who wanted to call himself a realtor. you could not practice unless you followed the code of ethics. Article 34 of the code of ethics says, a realtor shall never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. A form of this statement continued, this exact statement continued up to 1950. It got slightly changed just to use, they took out race, but they kept in individuals could drop property values, and everybody understood what that meant. So this carried on. So in 1927, Coronado's Realty Board aligned under the National Real Estate Board and the California Real Estate Association, which was the statewide body. In the 1930s, the federal government got into the game, and they actually, through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they began redlining the country in main cities. Coronado was part of that redlining activity of 1936. In the yellow part of Coronado, it's labeled C10. And they provided to all finance companies, all realtors, everyone across the country had access to this document. And it says here at C10, this area lies along the bay and is a desirable district. However, in this area is located the servants' quarters or the colored population of Coronado. There's considerable building going on at this time, and were it not for the colored population and a dump at the northeast portion of the area, this would be classified as a blue area and comparable to B13. So it sent a message that property values will be harmed by the presence of African Americans. I can assure you, I've been checking Redfin, and Kathy's house has been going up in value equivalent to our house over these last few years. So we did not bring any property values down. So that was a myth. It's a myth now, it was a myth then, right? So I want you to get a look there. This is a racially restrictive deed prepared on one single day by Coronado Realty Board President Lewis Millen in 1944. Lewis Millen co-founded the Coronado Historical Association. He bought the Spreckles Mansion, called it Millen Manor for a while. And I'm trying to see why this is shaking. Okay. I am not doing anything. So I'm trying to see why this is shaking. Okay, so you see those red dots. Those are entire city blocks in one swipe of a pen that were reserved only for Caucasians. Those 6 blocks, and you can see, I've taken a photo from 1935, and you can see the red stars. Those are those same blocks, empty in 1935. This was not the only, and so what that deed did to those properties in one single swipe, these were the properties that were the Palmer built homes, those who know our history. In the deed, it said that neither said lots nor any portion thereof or interest therein shall ever be leased, sold, devised, conveyed to, or inherited, or be otherwise acquired by, or become the property of any person other than of the Caucasian race. Cynthia Hudgens, who grew up in the 1940s, tried to buy a house in Coronado, couldn't do it. It turns out it was because her ancestry, even though her father owned a property and her grandfather owned a property in Coronado. Bayview Estates, everybody knows that beautiful estates that faces the San Diego skyline. 38 properties, I believe it was in total. Again, another covenant this time, which required everyone to vote every, I think, 10 or 20 years about keeping it Caucasian. So the entire Bayview Estates, all of it was Caucasian only. Country Club Estates. We all know they took over the golf course and built quite a number of homes. I think it's very important, if you look close, these were ads in our local paper. These properties were all restricted as well. Beautiful home sites for discriminating people. They kind of pushed the language of restriction. Exclusive meant keeping people out. Country Club Estates, exclusive, restricted. Home sites now available. And Country Club Estates, again, there's a mention of exclusive, restricted home sites. By 1963, California passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which immediately became opposed by the California Real Estate Association. You can see that's a meeting, that's a picket in front of San Diego where they were meeting, and people were picketing against CREA, that's California Real Estate Association, that they want segregation. And the reason is they were pushing to do an initiative, a ballot initiative called Prop 14. In this article, Governor Edmund Brown, the governor of California, spoke at the Hotel Del, condemning this initiative as racist and a segregationist initiative. What Prop 14 wanted to do was to give a person the right to do whatever the hell they wanted with their property, which makes kind of sense, right? But when they give absolute discriminatory powers, means they can kick someone out of a building because they're Black, and there was no recourse of that person, just because they don't like Black people. And we know that there was a shortage of housing for African Americans at this time. So what happened in Coronado with Prop 14? That's from the Coronado newspaper, Resist Bigotry, Defeat Prop 14. At the very bottom, it was sponsored by Jonas Salk of the Salk Institute, his wife actually, and one of the Marston family members who became quite adamant about how wrong this was. And then we also had freedom to sell or rent to anyone you choose. Yes, I'm 14, that went through. And then Martin Luther King, speaking in San Diego, calling this, that the passage of Prop 14 would be one of the most shameful developments in our nation's history. And it passed 2-1. In Coronado, it passed 3-1. The highest percentage of any city in San Diego County. And yet at that time, we were the only one left having a federal housing project with 774 low-income people who would probably want fair housing. So you can imagine, and that's how it voted. That's how the vote went on Prop 14 across. To give you an idea what an interesting time it was, you can see that Barry Goldwater got almost 3,000 votes to only 1,700 votes to Johnson and Coronado. So Coronado was pretty conservative at that time, clearly. And there's the rate of yes to no over 3-1. There was only one other city in the entire state of California that had a higher yes vote than Coronado. In 1966, they overturned Prop 14, which had passed, and Coronado realtors jumped to the gun and started organizing everyone in Coronado to write to their senator and the congressman to fight back against the civil rights laws and how awful fair housing was for our country. So I'm going to give you some just quick facts here. In 1927, the Coronado Realty Board aligned with the CREA and the National Real Estate Boards in an alliance that continued up to today, which is fine. Between 1927 and 1988, Coronado's population grew by nearly 20,000 people while the local Black population disappeared. During that period, just one African-American succeeded to purchase a home in Coronado in 1938. Ancestors of Coronado's African-American pioneers were denied an opportunity to generate wealth in their hometown, the town where their patriotic grandparents and parents lived and owned property. In 2020, the National Real Estate Board officially apologized for their role in residential segregation across the country. In 2022, CREA, California Real Estate Association, they also apologized. They said CREA sponsored policies which gave the state a tainted legacy of redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and a fear that integrated neighborhoods would damage property values. I'm here to say the association was wrong. We not only apologize for these actions, we strongly condemn them. We'll continue to working to address the legacy of discrimination policies and practices. So I want to finish up. I just needed to give you that. That's why Coronado demographically looks much the way it does today. There was a time we had a pioneering group that was 3% of the population. It does not exist anymore. And it's a story that's common across the country, and we're not we're not the exception, unfortunately. So I wanted to share with you a very unique story that happened that covers 138 years. I'm going to be quick. I know we're running out of time and people want to ask questions. We heard about Gus and Emma Thompson, who they actually married in 1893. They built that house right there in 1895. A few years later, they built that livery stable. And they lived and raised their kids in that home while running that business. As the kids left home, they started to spend more time in San Diego. So they would rent that house out to various immigrant families in Coronado. And in 1938, they rented that home to the Dong family. Lloyd Dong was a Chinese American gardener. His wife spoke no English. They had a 1-year-old kid. And they rented that home and raised 4 kids actually in that house. And those kids, one of them was valedictorian of Coronado High School. They all had successful lives in finance and in education. In 1955, after Gus had died, Emma kept her promise to Lloyd Dong, the father, and sold the property to the Dong family, both where the livery stable was and the house, and gave it to and sold it to the Dongs. So the Dongs have kept that property in their possession for the last 70, almost 70 years. And when I was doing research on the Thompsons, I contacted the Dongs. I asked them, what do you know about the Thompsons? They said, oh my God, we would have never been able to rent in Coronado as Chinese Americans if it wasn't for the Thompsons. And so I asked them what they remember about the Thompsons. So they then said in 1955, we couldn't have bought without the Thompsons. That's Lloyd, CH8 class of 1960. That's Ron, 1955. That's the 2 of them just 2 weeks ago here in Coronado. I called them. I said, hey, we're launching this exhibit. You want to come down and check it out? And they said, you won't believe what's happening. I'm like, what are you talking about? We're coming to San Diego. What are you doing? They said, well, we thought about what you wrote and what you said about the Thompsons. And we read your story and we reflected, and we have all the money we need. And we're getting old and we need to sell that property. So they said, we think it's time to give back. So they're putting that property up for sale. And they're 2 out of 3 of the ownership of the kids of that property. And they're pledging the entire proceeds of the money from that property, which will be around $5 million, to San Diego State Union's, San Diego State's University's Black Resource Center. All $5 million, and they're only pledging it if they rename that center the Gus and Emma Thompson Center, for what Gus and Emma Thompson did to help their family in Coronado. So that's paying it forward. And I thought that's a nice story for us to end on. Again, I appreciate your patience through some of the material. Some of it was not easy, but it's verified, it's truthful, and it is history. So with that, I'd love to take some questions if anybody has some.